Well, good morning, everyone. And I want to officially welcome you to the Trellis Foundation Summit on Post-Secondary Education, Access, Affordability, and Attainment. And it is my pleasure to introduce two of my professional colleagues, both of them highly accomplished in their respective fields, but also highly invested in the future of Texas and the vibrancy of their communities, the state, and the nation. Mr. Rob Kaplan serves as the President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, representing the 11th Federal Reserve District on the Federal Open Market Committee in the formulation of U.S. monetary policy, and he also oversees the 1,200 employees of the Dallas Fed. And prior to leading the Dallas Fed, Mr. Kaplan served as the faculty member and senior associate dean for the Harvard Business School. There is a much bigger description on Rob's, all of his accomplishments in your brochure that you can take a look at. And I also have the personal pleasure of serving on one of Rob's boards, the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, the El Paso branch, where I have seen firsthand his commitment and passion towards workforce, skills gap, and of course, monetary policy. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy Mr. Kaplan's comments today. In addition, we are very thrilled that Evan Smith, the founder and CEO of the Texas Tribune, is joining us to moderate this conversation with Rob Kaplan and the next panel with the Texas Commissioners. I have known Evan for about 7 years. He happens to be one of my Texas Lyceum brothers. I have tremendous respect for Evan's ability to grasp the complex issues and topics that are relevant to the state of Texas. Under his leadership, the Texas Tribune has achieved wide acclaim, including a Peabody Award, 13 National Edward R. Murrow Awards from the Radio, Television, Digital News Association, and 3 General Excellence Awards from the Online News Association. You might also recognize him as the host of Overheard with Evan Smith, a weekly half-hour interview program that airs on the PBS station. So please join me in a round of applause and welcome him to the stage, Mr. Evan Smith and Mr. Rob Kaplan. You got it, my friend.
Rob, good to see you. How are you?
Good.
Appreciate you being here. Hello, everybody.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thanks for making time for us today.
Sure. Congratulations on what you're doing. It's a great mission and great things you are doing. So I've been admiring your organization for a long time. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Here we go. So I want to begin by asking, in the time we have together, and we're going to talk for a while, and then in the last 15 or so minutes, we're going to open the floor for questions. So think of good things you'd like to ask that we haven't covered in our time together. Rob, I want to ask you about the health of the national economy. We are several hours from the approval of a spending bill in the dark of night that very few members of the Congress, House or Senate, probably read. We are several months out from a tax bill that was itself very controversial, and there are questions about whether the tax bill is going to have the unintended consequence of raising rather than lowering the federal deficit. We've had now more than a year of the Trump administration in office. Give us an assessment of that time and of how the economy of the federal government is doing. Pull no punches and be specific.
All right, fine. So let me, I'll stay away from the political aspects of this, which
Sure.
is part of my job to stay away from that.
Sure.
I'll give you the good news and then the things that are worrisome, which fit right into what Trellis Foundation does.
Yeah.
The good news, 2018 is going to be a year of strong growth, we believe, in the United States. Our own forecast of the Dallas Fed is that GDP growth will be 2.5%, 2.75%. By the way, Texas is going to have a good year too,
Yeah.
and I can talk about
And
Texas
we'll
separately.
come to Texas next.
But the United States, we're going to have a year of strong growth. Why? 2 or 3 reasons. One, the household sector has spent the last 8 or 9 years deleveraging. Household sector is in pretty good shape. Job market we know is strong, which also helps the household sector. Consumer, 70% of the economy. Business spending should be a little stronger than expected, due some to the recent legislation. And global growth's better than we expected. So we think it's going to be a good year. That's the good news. The more challenging issue is next year and the year after. Our own forecast of the Dallas Fed is next year's growth will moderate from this year, will be lower. And by 2020 or so, we should start trending down to GDP growth closer to 1.75%. Now you say, why? Well, here's the reason why. 3 issues. Aging demographics, i.e. slowing workforce growth in this country. Most of us in this room grew up in our careers where demographics were improving. We are now aging, and because of that, people are retiring out of the workforce, which is one of the reasons why the participation rate has been stuck around 63%. We think participation over the next 10 years will go lower, mainly due to demographics. Number 2, sluggish productivity, which gets into skill levels and education we can talk about. And third, while there's some positive elements of the recent legislation, corporate tax reform, I would argue, should have had some sustainable effect. A big bulk of the tax legislation plus this recent budget bill was increasing debt to GDP. And I think in the years ahead, that will be a headwind, is my fear, for economic growth in the United States.
Right.
And so those are the 3 big issues I worry about.
You know, the average person who doesn't know as much about the economy as you or as much as most of the people in this room know, look at the volatility of the stock market over the recent couple of months and they wonder what's going on. Is that a good metric for success? Or is that totally divorced from the question of whether the economy is healthy?
It's a little bit divorced, I'll tell you why. The part for me which was unusual was before February, we'd gone 15 months with historically low volatility. We'd gone 15 months without a 3% decline. When's the last time that happened? Closest you're going to find, late 50s?
Right.
So I actually would argue the current levels of volatility, while it's jarring to people, is a little bit more typical. Now, having said that, it makes sense to pay attention to the markets.
Right.
But volatility alone, I think a little higher volatility is more normal for the markets, and so that alone does not alarm me.
You subscribe to the theory that the volatility of the market is as much about political anxiety as economic anxiety without regard to the specific politics?
The volatility of the market is about the fact that markets go up and down.
Right.
And the weird thing we had over 15 months
Right.
is we had a period of unusually low volatility, just up, 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 up. That's the anomaly, not what's going on recently.
I want to pivot to Texas. Obviously, people in this room are particularly focused on the health of the Texas economy. We are used to good economic times in Texas that actually are better than, relatively speaking, economic times in other states. One of the reasons that we all love Texas so much is Texas tends to be ahead of a lot of other places on the economy and everything else. Tuesday at the Capitol, at a Senate hearing, the Comptroller, Glenn Hager, warned that the credit rating agencies may have to lower the Texas bond rating. He specifically said, quote, "We're not at a crisis, but we're going in the wrong direction." And there are a lot of things that went into that calculation, Rob. The 86th legislature is going to start about $8 billion in the hole. That much of that is Medicaid related. They're going to have to go back and refill the Medicaid hole. There's a sales tax deferral for transportation. There's a $240 million gap in the Texas Tomorrow Fund. There's the school finance property tax conundrum that we'll talk about, I think, in the next panel specifically. There's $440 million in sales tax revenue lost due to the Internet Tax Freedom Act. There's the underfunding of pensions, and we haven't even gotten to Harvey yet. The comptroller, who is not one to be an alarmist or a drama queen, said we're heading in the wrong direction, and everybody's eyebrows raised. Did yours?
Well, here's the short answer is Texas and a number of its cities have financial challenges. The reason I don't get that excited or nervous about it is Texas got one other countervailing thing going for it. I told you workforce growth is a problem in the United States. Texas has got migration of people and firms to this state ahead of, and therefore workforce growth faster than most other states in the country.
We added more people in the last year, according to the census, yet again than any other state.
Why do states or cities have economic problems? Why did Detroit go bankrupt? Yeah, there were a lot of reasons, but the primary was loss of population. Texas population growth, based on everything we know, it's been ahead of the country, and it's continuing. Unfortunately, we're taking it from elsewhere in the country, but in this war for people in the United States, we're winning that war. So are there economic challenges and things the legislature will have to do and cities have? Absolutely. Should we be able to do it? Yes, absolutely. Our problems here are manageable and they're in our control because we have population growth and workforce growth, mainly because of migration and people and firms to the state. So no, I think that it's manageable.
You say that the population growth is a driver for us. I want to come back to what population growth will ultimately mean for Texas in terms of straining the resources we have available.
Right.
But I want to ask you about a couple of other issues that are out in the air that have a direct effect on us that maybe we don't control as much of. The first thing is trade and NAFTA. Two very important topics for Texas. There's concern that some kind of a renegotiation of NAFTA, which has been very beneficial, it seems inarguable to Texas, would have a negative effect. Pair that with the president's stance on tariffs and what that would mean for the country and what that would mean for Texas.
So this matters a lot to Texas. We're the largest exporting state in the country. Okay? And so, and also it's our view, and by the way, Mexico is our #1 trading partner in Texas. It's one of our top 2 or 3 trading partners in the United States. It's our own, we do a lot of research on this in the Dallas Fed. The bottom line is this. We think while trade may have cost jobs in the United States 10 or 15 years ago, trade today, as we sit here, is more likely an opportunity for the United States to grow. We're 5% of the world's population. And the fact of the matter is, most of our trade with Mexico and Canada, for example, are intermediate goods. They're not final goods. They're part of logistics and supply chain arrangements that allow us to add jobs in Texas and in the United States and grow faster. And so it is not in the interest of the United States. Anything that impedes global trade is more likely to impede growth. I'd say globalization.
Have you sent a carrier pigeon to Washington with that message?
So the only caution I'd give since this tariff talk started, my only comment has been, just wait a little bit. Let's see what ultimately gets implemented. Let's see what are negotiating tactics, and I'll stay away from the political elements. Negotiating tactics versus checks, and then we've seen exemptions. Even vis-a-vis China. My guess is you'll see this part of a quote-unquote negotiation. Now, you could disagree, and I could see debate about, is this the right tactics? But ultimately, I think when we look back 2 years from now, I would be hopeful, at least, because it's so clearly in the interest of the United States to have fair, open trade and not have tariffs.
That this will be dialed back.
That would be my guess, yes.
Oil is a concern for the state of Texas always. Back in the bad old days when oil was 22% of the Texas economy and everything went into the drink, we were much more concerned about the impact of oil. It still has an impact on us, although I think the controller says it's 14% now rather than 22%.
It's closer to 8 or 9. It was as high as 14. It's closer to specifically
we're now
8 or 9.
actually high single digits, so we're even more insulated than that.
Because we become diversified.
But it still matters.
Matters
there
a
are still
lot.
people that wake up in the state of Texas every day, and the way that I check Twitter first in the morning, people check the price of oil.
And it's it's a very large percentage of job growth in the state.
So what's your view of where we're heading 6 months, 12 months, 24 months in terms of the price of oil?
So it's interesting. So the good news, state's diversified a lot, but I got to tell you, as I sit here now and we look out ahead on energy, we think at the Dallas Fed, and we do a lot of work on this and a lot with the industry, informs this. Over the next 3 to 5 years, first of all, this year we think production growth in the United States is going to be net 1 million barrels. 70% of that growth is going to come from the Permian Basin. Okay? So, and we think over the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to see price volatility, but you're going to see very healthy shale growth. But we still think it's unlikely to keep up with growth in global demand, interestingly. So the next 3 to 5 years, we think you'll be in a fragile equilibrium where prices will go like this. You'll have lots of production. You may have prices be lower, higher. We would guess 3 to 5 years out, the price risk actually is to the upside because we still believe global growth, even with growth in alternatives, is going to outstrip shale because the decline curve is so rapid. So the outlook for the energy business and in Texas, pretty positive.
Good news.
I would say the dynamics of this industry are pretty attractive right now.
All right, one other big national issue that the narrow end of the funnel hits Texas disproportionately as oil does, and that's immigration and border security. So we have been consumed in the state over the last number of years by a conversation about net migration, about undocumented labor, DACA, sanctuary cities, and the whole portfolio of issues. How do you assess the immigration issue and the economy diverging and converging here over the next couple years?
So let's take it in pieces. Interestingly, our own analysis suggests that net migration from Mexico over the last 2 or 3 years is zero.
Zero, right.
Okay? So that's that.
Right.
Second, why? Because Mexico economy is stronger, better safety net, smaller family size, lots of reasons there. Second, though, undocumented immigrants are who are living here are a big part of the economy. So, for example, in the aftermath of Harvey, you know, we spent a lot of time in Houston. It's the estimate that there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 550,000 of the residents of Houston, the greater Houston area, are undocumented. Maybe as high as half the construction force.
Right. Who's going to rebuild the 22% of the state impacted by Harvey? Undocumented labor.
So
right.
our big issue at the Dallas Fed has been not to take a position on how to deal with all this, but to make the point. Immigrants and their children have made up over half the workforce growth in the United States over the last 20 years. We think they're going to be close to 100% in the next 20. How do we know that? Because we can project native-born population growth and workforce growth is going to be negative. And so it would behoove the United States to find a way to come to a resolution on how we treat immigrants here.
Yeah.
But also, we've been advocating, in its sensitive comment at the Dallas Fed, more skills-based immigration. Maybe tougher, more like Canada.
Yeah.
But to think, what we've said, though, if you think you're going to cut immigration by half, which some legislation has called for,
right.
and grow GDP, those two things do not
go
together.
And again, to be clear, the issue is not just cutting undocumented immigration or illegal immigration, but there's a discussion of reducing legal immigration.
We need immigration, whether we like it or not. Something's got to give. I mentioned slow workforce growth, slow productivity, which we're going to get to,
yeah.
and it wouldn't matter so much if we weren't so highly leveraged at the government level. But we've got to grow faster. Every day we grow in the 2s or less,
yeah.
we get more leveraged. And our kids and our grandkids are going to have to pay this bill. Yeah. And so we can't have everything. We've got to find ways
right.
to grow faster. Workforce growth is part of it. Immigration is a big part of
right.
workforce growth.
On the immigration question, I gather the president is rattling his Twitter this morning about possibly not signing the spending bill because he's concerned that the border wall was not funded to the level that he wanted. It was only about $1 billion and change as opposed to the full amount. So is the border wall good for the Texas economy?
I
Yes
only
or no?
have one comment on the border wall as part of the overall rhetoric that I'm most concerned about,
right.
and it relates to the presidential election in Mexico. That's my number one concern.
Explain.
As it relates to Texas. Why? There hasn't been enough attention focused. In July of 2018, there's a presidential election in Mexico. The leading candidate in the race right now is a more quote-unquote left-wing candidate who is more negative about relationships with the United States. We have gotten accustomed to very constructive relationships on our border. If that candidate gets elected and the rhetoric, including the wall, is having an effect domestically there, I think everything will get tougher, including trade relationships with Mexico. And I think it is not in the geopolitical interest of the United States.
Right.
And when I hear talk about the wall, that's what I think of first, the impact on domestic politics and this election in Mexico.
What's the Harvey effect going to be on the economy in your estimation for the next 2 years?
Well, our analysis has been, it's playing out that way, while the damage we think is estimated could be as high as $65–70 billion, and a lot of it is uninsured. It's been our view that it would reduce GDP growth in the third quarter, that we would have a bounce back in the fourth quarter, and that by the first quarter, and this is panning out, first quarter of this year, we thought we'd get back to the GDP level in Texas that we would have been at, and we'll resume trend growth. And that is the way it's playing out.
Yeah.
Now, some of you who watch this notice car sales have been buffeted around. There's a reason for that. There was a big replenishment. We think $10–12 billion in cars were damaged.
One out of every 7 cars is what I understood.
So you had a bump in car sales. We've seen it now return down.
Right.
But in terms of Texas and the country, while there's a lot of harm and families having to come out of pocket and need for government assistance, in terms of GDP for the state and for the country, you'll look back and say, we'll resume trend growth. The history of these hurricanes, by the way, is if your economy was growing before, this won't interrupt a hurricane. If your economy, like Puerto Rico, was struggling or you had declines, this could make it worse. New Orleans, this could make it worse. Because Houston has been doing so well and Texas doing so well, we think it will not impede GDP growth.
So back on this population question, Rob, so the demographers are predicting that the population of Texas will almost double between now and 2050.
Right.
The predictions have been as much as 55 million people
That's right.
in the state of Texas by 2050, which is barely 30 years
And in the
from
Fed,
now.
where the second largest district will
Right.
become the largest district in the country.
So how do we accommodate 55 million people in a state with finite resources, social and physical infrastructure? This group cares about education, but not only education. How do we provide adequate education, health care, water, air, broadband to a state with 55 million people? That's 12 pounds of rice in a 6-pound bag.
Right.
But the reality is today we're 6 pounds of rice in a 4-pound bag.
So this is a positive on the one hand, and on the other hand, to your point, this is why it's imperative, early childhood literacy, college readiness, improved secondary education, improved skills training, because wealth inequality, all the studies we've seen show wealth inequality will grow with this population growth. Housing costs will increase. Number of uninsured, we've already got the highest level of number of uninsured in the country. Access to medical services. And so all our problems in the state, the good news because of wealth and population, are in our control. But I would argue we need to be prioritizing even more highly, and foundations like yours, the work you're doing, has never been more important if we're going to keep
Well, I hear you say that they're in our control, and I'll stipulate that that's true, except there
if
doesn't
we decide
seem,
to control them.
Well, that's the point. It's like, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play?
By the way, the reason I mention this, Evan, there are states in this country, I'll throw out a few, Illinois, others, where I'm not sure it is in their control because they don't have the population. We actually can make the choices here because we have the resources. And I view, we're playing a pretty good hand here because we can actually make decisions, and we've got the wealth and the income and the population to actually solve these problems. That's a great position to be in. We shouldn't take it for granted.
I'm going to push back a little bit in this respect. We have the wallet. Do we have the will? Okay? The state share of funding public education is down significantly. The state share of funding higher education is down significantly.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
Yes, that the uninsured population is lower than it was before the Affordable Care Act, but that's despite rather than because. Time and again, if the state has the wallet, it is not necessarily shown it has the will. Why are you optimistic?
I'm optimistic because this state, one thing, I've only lived here 2.5 years, by the way. My father used to travel this state as a jewelry salesman, so I lived in Kansas. But one thing I've learned about this state is this state and the people of this state are, at the end of the day, highly practical, want to see growth and prosperity. And it is so clear that the issues you're working on and we're talking about, and education, workforce development, is so clearly tied to future growth and prosperity of the state that I believe ultimately we'll make the right decisions because it's so clearly in our interest. That's why I'm optimistic.
What about one aspect of this population
That doesn't mean
growth?
we will.
Right, but it means but you're at least optimistic that we could.
I think it's so clearly in our economic interest. That's why I think we will.
So another aspect of this population growth is the demographic tumult and unrest and change that is coming. And for the state of Texas, it's going to be a wonderful opportunity, but it's also going to be a challenge.
And it's happening nationwide. We're just ahead of it.
And the population sector that is growing the fastest also happens to be less college ready on average, less completion from higher ed in some form on average, more underinsured. Kind of go down the list of social and physical infrastructure issues, tends to be at the lower end of the. So with the specific challenge of demographic inevitability, how do we address this set of problems?
So here's why it's so tough. It actually, in my view, if you start with secondary education, you're already too late. I'm a big fan of, I believe you got to start with early childhood literacy, 0 to 5, and this means
half day or full day?
A few hours a day. Just read to kids every day. I used to be on the board, and I used to read to a child during his lunch hour for years. But I had no government involvement. We did it private business. Children need to be, especially in these at-risk groups, they need to be read to when they're 2, 3, and 4 years old, because if they start first grade behind grade level, studies show they never catch up.
It's too late. Can we solve that early childhood problem without government resources?
I actually think more than that, it's going to take nonprofits working with business and volunteers like all of us here and people at companies to actually get at it. We convene groups like this. I'm looking at Alfreda Norman here in the back. We convene groups to try to get these early childhood programs going in the state of Texas. I'm sure Trellis, I can tell from what you've been doing, you do a lot. I think all of us, I always say, this can't be somebody else's problems. We each need to leave, all of us, including me, by the way, and say, what can I do to encourage these reading programs to get kids, when they start in first grade, more ready.
So government's not the only answer, but government at least has to be part of the answer.
I actually don't think on early childhood. I think it probably has to be less, what I've found, probably has to be more private business and nonprofits than government even. I don't know that government can get at this as easily as nonprofits and business can.
We're racing through our time. You alluded to the question of the skills gap.
Yeah.
We know that the skills gap is an issue nationally as we try to look at the nexus of education and workforce. How much of a problem is it in Texas? And if it is a problem, why? And what are the takeaways for the folks in this room as we try to narrow the skills gap?
So just give you an idea, nationally 50% of small businesses say they can't find skilled workers. 60% in our surveys of small businesses in Texas say they can't find skilled workers, okay? So the jobs are there. So why is this? Two reasons. One, and a lot of the junior colleges in this state, I think, do a better job than elsewhere. We need to train businesses partnering with junior colleges to provide some of the teachers and train. But secondly, we're also lagging in Texas as well as the nation, but Texas lagging the nation. Math skills, reading in particular skills, we're lagging. And a lot of businesses, when you ask them, their technical skills they're lacking, but they're also, they call them the soft skills. 40% of them say, we can't find workers who have the soft skills. What are those? Reading, will work a full week, discipline, ability to fit into a work environment. And so when you do these middle skills training and also other training, we got to focus on the technical skills, but also just getting ready, people comfortable being in a work environment.
Right. Let me try to draw you out before we go to the audience on the two aspects of that are the long tail.
Yeah.
And that is, how do we get people trained? How do we get people prepared? How do we make certain that we have the right workforce? It begins with education, as you say.
Yeah.
Public ed and higher ed. School Finance Commission met this week. They're studying in the interim what fixes are required to make the school finance system work.
Right.
The last opportunity the Supreme Court had to require the legislature to fix it, they passed. They said lawful but awful.
Yeah.
Legislature came in and ultimately did not fix the problem. In the meantime, there are more than 80,000 kids added to the public school system every year. Can you see a way for us to close the skills gap without investing more in public education in Texas?
No, and in addition, I think we're going to have a statewide, and I would say this is true nationally too, but I'll start with the state, statewide crusade on early childhood, pre-first grade literacy. I mean, we should have it, and enlist businesses, enlist nonprofits, enlist people in these communities. My guess is that early childhood is as important as spending more money on secondary education. We're going to need to do both, for sure. And it's a great, by the way, great investment. It's a fantastic investment.
The part B of this is the higher ed investment and the degree to which the state is no longer doing what is its bare minimum obligation on that. And I want to ask about that because this week the University of Texas System Regents, obviously only one of the state university systems, voted unanimously to raise tuition rates over the next couple of years. It was somewhere between, in most instances, 1% and 7%.
Yeah.
The statistic that jumped out at me, and this is actually from the Tribune's reporting on this, the last 15 years, the state appropriation per student, higher ed student, dropped from $8,000 to $6,000, while the cost of tuition and fees borne by parents and students rose from $5,000 to $8,000.
I understand.
Are we constitutionally compliant any longer with the obligation of providing a university of the first class if we're passing so much of the cost out of the state budget and onto families?
It's an issue, but I must admit, one thing I've found as a business person, I like to think about what are my first and second priorities, because I know if you have 5, you might do none. I think all those things are right. I agree with everything you said, except because the graduation rate, particularly among Hispanics, is so low in the state of Texas, it tells me we got to move earlier. The problem is earlier, okay? So studies have shown if you graduate college, if you graduate and you have debt, it's not great and it should be addressed, but you'll work through it. If you go to college and you don't graduate in 6 years and you have debt, it's a disaster.
Right.
And my problem, it tells me we need to be focusing earlier, and everything you said is right, But if I had to put a priority, we've got to have a statewide crusade on early childhood literacy and getting kids earlier, much earlier, because college readiness, clearly among the fastest growing demographic,
Right.
is not cutting it, and it's too late. You could solve all these problems at the college level. It will not address this issue.
So you draw a straight line between early childhood and higher ed attainment and completion.
Yes, I do.
And then dotted line
I
out
do.
to workforce.
I do. I could be wrong, but I do.
Okay, well, that's fine. That's a position. That's good.
Yeah, that's what I believe.
Okay, we've got about 10, 12 minutes, and we have time for questions from really the most learned audience you could ask for. So if you didn't like my questions, watch out. We have a microphone here, and I gather we're gonna walk a microphone around. Gentleman in the back right there by the camera, we'll start there. And she's gonna walk the microphone around to you, sir.
Thank you. I'm Steve Jacobs, Capital Idea here in Austin. We've been educating adults to get through Dr. Rhodes College into nursing and tech.
Yep.
That's great.
20
Congratulations.
years. Next year we can buy a beer. We'll be legal next year.
Yep.
Great.
One of the things that we've seen and we've got some data on is that if you take someone who didn't go to college, they're an adult,
Yeah.
get them to college, then they bring all their kids along. We had the UT folks go into the student success data, find that 70% of these kids who were in child care when their moms and dads got their nursing degree, now 20 years later, 70% are going directly to college.
Right.
So we'd
Makes
be
sense.
kind of curious your reactions to a strategy. It's sort of like a buy one, get two or three free strategy.
Right.
Go to the adult. They're 30 years old. We're not going to get them early childhood age, but they, by the experience in the community college, absorb what they need to do the reading to the kids, to bring them along. What's a FAFSA? What's an
I mean,
SAT?
everything I've seen, and I was on the state healthcare mission in Kansas, everything flows from the parents and the role model from the parents. I think that makes total sense. Listen, my parents were the first in their families to ever go to college. It makes a huge difference. Many of us have been through it, and I agree, makes complete sense.
It's cultural. It's behavioral.
And role model. Listen, kids need
Right.
role models. That's the biggest, all of us, including, we all grew up, we need them. And
Right.
our parents are primary role models. Many students and kids in at-risk groups don't have, maybe it's single parent or no parent, and so we need to do other things to intervene. But if your parents can be role models, it's fantastic.
But isn't affordability still an impediment, even if you're able to make the cultural or behavioral switch
is.
flip? There's still an affordability question.
It is, but if I had to prioritize effort, I want earlier, but listen, to help people workforce development, get a nursing degree, pipe fitter, automotive technician, all those, beautiful. Especially, I love that you said 30 years old. I'm more worried about people that have to get retrained in their 30s and 40s, which is really tough to do. And to the extent we can put money at that, I almost think that's a higher priority. Well, you have to choose someplace if
Yep.
we have finite resources. This is clearly, everything shows those people get employed at an extraordinarily high rate.
Good. Susan, hi.
Thank you. Susan Dawson with E3 Alliance. You mentioned the importance of immigrants to our economy.
Yeah.
We didn't touch directly at all on English language learners.
Yeah.
We have lots of data that shows English language learners are often challenged much more than other groups in schools.
Yeah.
We also have data that shows that those students who succeed in multiple languages actually outperform their English-speaking peers
Yeah.
and can be a huge benefit into a bilingual, bicultural workforce
Yeah.
of the future. What is your view on building English language learners as an asset for our state?
Well, it's clear, and everything we see, reading levels, and part of this is mixed with demographics, and I love what the introductory speaker said, you got to disaggregate the data. But if you start first grade and you don't have good English language skills, you're never going to catch up. And so reading to kids, and every study I've seen, because I've been involved in it for the last 25 years, reading to kids 2, 3, and 4 makes a huge difference to their English language skills. So I believe it strongly.
That's absolutely true. I'm also going to send you some data on the state investments that are required in pre-K to make kindergarten readiness happen, because we have the best data in the state.
Good.
And we've got it and can send it to you.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Other questions for the commissioner, for the chair of the Fed, president of the Fed?
Fire away.
Thanks. I'm Andrew White. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
You mentioned our state needs leaders who make decisions in our economic interests. So I have to ask the question, what's the Federal Reserve stance on the bathroom bill?
So it will not shock you.
I'm glad I didn't ask that
It
question.
will not shock you that I'm not going to get into that, other than to say the following. We just have to keep in mind and this isn't the only issue. There are other social issues. One of the great we take for granted a bit, maybe being here. One of the great assets of this state is migration of people and firms to the state. It's been going on since 2000. We grow at 1% faster than the rest of the country. Enormous tailwind. Anything we do that makes it scarier for people to come here, make them nervous about coming here, that would impede that, is bad for the future of the state, period.
I'm going to take the specific sharp object of the bathroom bill off the table, but I'm going to remain in this conversation and ask you about this topic.
Yeah.
Because there has been over the last year a pretty consistent conversation around the degree to which Texas, which likes to puff its chest out and say how business friendly it is walking the walk. On the bathroom bill, obviously that's one thing, but on education, on immigration, the business community has actually been louder than it has been in my experience in Texas.
Which is good.
In saying we should not be passing laws or failing to embrace policies that get in the way of business activity in the state. Is this a reasonable concern? Is this like a low-grade fever at this point? Is there something more problematic that you see on the horizon? Because I don't recall, except for really the last sort of 12 to 18 months, the level of conversation around the degree to which the state is getting in its own way on the economy.
So here's the good news. Yeah. I'm encouraged, one of the positive things, I'm encouraged that businesses are stepping up. We need to, including, by the way, on sustainability, which is also an issue for the state. Quality of the water in the state is going to be an issue. Every study I've seen. And so businesses better be speaking up. And in some cases, in this country, forget Texas, businesses are ahead of the government.
I don't care about the rest of the country. I care about Texas. I want you to be specific about Texas.
I think the fact that businesses are pushing this tells you, that political community leaders need to catch up to that. These are legitimate concerns, of course.
Government should listen.
Of course.
Okay, well, you say of course. You make it sound like it's matter of fact.
I'll just say yes.
Yes, okay.
How's that? Better answer?
All right, let's take another for Mr. Kaplan in the back. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you so much for being here, Rob. You talked earlier that you thought that pre-K might be a better role for the private sector as opposed to the public sector.
Probably all levels the business sector needs to be involved, particularly workforce development can't happen without the private sector, for example.
But specifically, we're mostly focused today on higher ed.
Yeah, the reason I mentioned pre-K, and I'll let you finish your question, is because it's not the first thing we mention, and my worry is we're jumping too late, and if we don't fix that early, we've got to start there. That's why I always mention it.
No, totally get it. When you think about higher ed, though, when you think
sir.
about both sort of research institutions, regional universities that are primarily, less focused on research, more on students, community colleges, technical schools, from an economics term, how do you think about the appropriate mix of investment? You saw the slides earlier about the mix of federal, state, local. From a business community perspective, how does that investment in R&D, particularly in a 21st century economy, how are you viewing that?
So let's put it this way. While I'm all in favor of if somebody can finish college within even 6 years, I think it's better for them to go, because literally such a high percentages aren't finishing. It tells me we should be encouraging them more and putting more money and more awareness in middle skills training, which are middle class jobs, outstanding jobs. And so it tells me maybe there needs to be a better balance between talking about these 2-year degrees or middle skills training and balancing that with everybody ought to go to college. If you're not going to finish in 6 years, I think clearly you've been better off trying another route. And it must be that a meaningful percentage of people going to college, they're not ready. I don't blame the college. I just think they weren't ready or it wasn't a good fit.
So you blame public ed for not doing
this
its job?
No, I think it's a lack of awareness. We need to educate young people. When I say, gee, your son could be a pipe, or your daughter could be a pipe fitter or automotive technician. Okay, your automotive technician is the highest person in a car dealer today. Used to be the salesperson. that person make $175,000 a year.
Make more than a philosophy major.
Yeah,
that's for sure,
and then
right,
just sort
yeah.
of say, wow, I did not know that. I think there's a lack of awareness, and in our public discussions, and I try to do this everywhere I go, these are middle-class jobs, very attractive, and I just think there's a lack of awareness. If young people knew that and their parents, we might have a little more balanced discussion about it.
So Rob, what does the state policy connect to that? So if that's the input, what is the output? If that's the finding, what should the legislature, as it goes in January, be pivoting toward?
It's state and, by the way, cities play a giant role in this, is just taking a hard look as they allocate. Now, the nice thing about middle skills training, a lot of it is being funded by the private sector because it's in their interest, okay?
Right.
And also, but you need a community college or high school leader that's used to going out and dealing with businesses. So I don't know if it's as much as a money problem or as a lack of awareness. And leaders need to be talking in a more balanced way about the menu, starting from early childhood all the way through college. I'd rather see a more holistic discussion about the options, which include middle skills, early childhood literacy, all the levels from start to finish, I think would be better.
Got it. I think there's one more. Is there one more? We're just about at the end of our time, and I know we need to reset the stage. Okay, why don't we go ahead and cut it off then?
All right,
Let us
thank
give
you.
Rob Kaplan
Thanks,
a
everybody.
big hand. Thank you. I
Thanks,
enjoyed
Kevin.
it. Good
Thank
to see
you.
you again.
Good to
Thanks.
talk
Very
to you.
good. Okay, bye.